Forget about it.
You know, I didn't want to do this. I really didn't. You know, right now, I have to work on a review for Chrono Trigger, an actual good game. And I have to review 20XX because someone sent that to me and it was a lot of fun. And I'm thinking about having to talk about Rosenkreuzstilett because I actually managed to make some progress on that game on stream, and I'm actually quite proud of myself because that game is bitterly hard. And yet, it's been brought to my attention that for some reason, Gex is getting a collection. And I want to get ahead of that because the fact is, I do not care for this game. And as cynical as it is, I can only see two potential reasons that any collection for Gex would ever come out. First, I can only assume that they're planning on making this collection to Gexploit nostalgia for this series, but how many people are actually nostalgic for it? It was a subpar series at best, wasn't it? The other is to gauge interest in making a new Gex game, which no one wants a new Gex game. We didn't want one Gex game. We didn't want the 5 we got. We don't need a 6th, plus a collection. Gex was a bad idea from the start. Please no more Gex. I thought I had managed to get away from Gex 20 years ago, and yet he's coming back. This guy doesn't deserve to come back. That'd be like bringing back Bubsy, except they did that too, and somehow Bubsy is actually a better character, which is a terrifying prospect. You probably have no idea what I'm on about right now, so let me explain. Gex is definitely one of those games. The kind of game that will always be sitting on your video store shelf because no one wants to rent this, like I mentioned with Shadowgate, or the abysmal Glover. And the only reason you would ever rent Gex yourself is because you need to rent something, you only have one game and you can't beat it, and the fact is, there's nothing else available. So it's kind of like the participation award of game rentals of sorts. It's a thing you have if you genuinely can't get anything of value. Actually, there's an extra caveat to me renting Gex, and that is that my local video store also had the sequel to this, but I'm pretty sure someone stole it and the 15-year-olds behind the counter couldn't tell the difference, so every time you rented the sequel, they just gave you this one and you were sad because while the sequel was still a bad game, it was marginally better, and there was a lot more creativity in the stage design. This game doesn't have that working for it. Gex is a bad game. It's certainly not the worst game on the system. I could still name several armors on the system that are objectively worse. Starshot, for one, is god-awful. I might have to play that sometime soon. Oh, I don't want to do that. But my point is that Gex is not a good game. It's at best a below-average 3D platformer with a huge amount of issues. And I think there are 3 huge pillars of failure propping this game up, so to speak. And the first big pillar of failure for Gex is Gex himself as a character. Now, you might be wondering what the story to Gexistence is, and the short version is, there isn't one. You start the game, you see a little splash screen where Gex gives one of his hilarious catchphrases, and then you're presented with a start screen that's overlaid over top of the start spawn point. You just then go to the start spawn point, that's it, there's no story. And I think the reason is that I'm pretty sure this is like a port of the PS1 version, and the PS1 version actually did have a story. It was all told through an FMV that they couldn't find a way to shove onto the cart or use stills or give us anything, so instead we get the amazing feature of not having plot in this game. I mean, I get that they needed to free up space to fit this on a cartridge, but axing all of the story seems a little Gex-stream to me. The game doesn't have an ending either. You just hit the final boss 6 times in a row, he turns into a little blob, and then you see credits, which proceed to just show you the hidden collectibles, which I already collected, so what's the point in that? There's no value to this. It's cheap, it's lazy, and it feels as half-assed as everything else in this game. But because I like you so much, I may have actually gone out and bought the PS1 version on PSN, just so I could record the FMV sequence, so we can actually figure out what the plot to this stupid thing is. But bear in mind, if you actually want to play the N64 version, you're not getting this. Okay, so the plot to Gex is basically, Gex is the cousin of the Geico Gecko, but infinitely less popular. He's very jealous of his cousin, but he does live in Hawaii with his family and he's having a good time. Except his dad was an astronaut who died in a space accident, and he got really, really sad and depressed and became a shut-in watching nothing but TV. Then his uncle passed away and he got a huge settlement because undisclosed reasons, and he bought a big mansion with an even bigger TV and basically dedicated the rest of his life to TV. In fact, they kind of point out that he kind of removed his entire personality to replace it with references. At one point, he gets sucked into a TV, where he then has to find a way to escape and defeat Rez, some robot guy who claims to be his father, but that's really more just a bad pop culture reference and running joke that never gets resolved, which to be fair is pretty on point for this series. And, well, in this game, he basically has to do it again. A second time. Be thankful I spared you the fact that Gex has a girlfriend that's both a secret agent and an actual actress from Baywatch, because for some reason they wanted to include a live-action girlfriend for Gex. How did she fall for this? I don't want to think about the implications of the human girlfriend to this stupid lizard, because for as weird and wrong as it was when Sonic tried interspecies romance, Gex did it well before, but I'm exposing myself to all this for you. The biggest issue Gex has is the fact that he has, by the series' kind of own admission, not had a personality. All he is a series of references. And this is why I would say that for how much Bubsy gets dunked on, Bubsy's a better, more well-rounded character than Gex. Sure, Bubsy is bad wordplay puns, but at least that takes effort to write. Pop culture references are just pointing at a thing that people kinda recognize and saying, look at this, you see this, you know this, it's this! And that's supposed to substitute a character for Gex. I cannot connect with Gex on any real level because he doesn't have a character to connect with. By design, which is a baffling choice. But you know what's even worse? Is to build an entire character around pop culture references that don't hit, because you don't recognize the pop culture references. And look, you might be saying, well, Fury, you know, you gotta look at this from a 90s perspective, and not a 2020s perspective. I mean, that's part of the reason why a collection of Gex games won't really work, but I digress. I'm from the 90s. I grew up with this game. I still don't understand half the references in this game. They are badly made references that don't hit the target audience for this game, and that's a fundamental problem. Okay, you know what? I was actually thinking about this while I was playing the game. There is, I think, a total of one way you could make Gex, with his existing backstory as it is, an actually interesting character. Hear me out here, but I think Gex could actually work as a character if they decide to go a completely different direction with the way they made him. Instead of being a smug Me Too mascot platformer who's desperately trying to be Sonic the Hedgehog or Bubsy or something, instead, you make him a tragic figure. You make him the face of television addiction and someone who's having trouble keeping a grasp on what's real and what's fiction. And as their understanding of the world and the reality around them begins to swim, blending with the TV world, you could actually have him struggle to keep his own sanity in check. It'd be a much darker game, but it would at least lead to an interesting character instead of just bad references. So yeah, in the N64 version, there's just not a ton of Gexposition. Now, when you spawn into Gexistence, the first thing you are greeted with in this hub world is a little diamond thing that tells you, hey, check out the big multi-directional camera and see how awesome it is to control your camera. At which point you can play around with the camera a little bit, and I hope you really enjoy this feature because it immediately gets taken away in every other situation after this point. Yeah, and thus we come to the second biggest pillar of awful that's holding this game up, and that is one of the worst cameras on the N64. Again, probably not the worst, but it's up there. Frequently, your camera will just get stuck on bits of the environment. It will frequently just not be in your control, and the best thing about that is they have a really loud, obnoxious stock sound effect for if you can't move your camera, which you will hear a lot. Like, more than any other sound in this game, so that's definitely not going to get annoying very, very, very quickly, except it will. Then you have like weird situations where the camera will just like flip between different perspectives and stuff relative to your character based on where they think the camera should be in each room. It's out of your hands and you have no real control around it. And you'll be frequently wrestling against the camera every step of the way. Now, to be fair, camera controls in 3D environments, especially for the time, were very, very difficult. It wasn't until much later in the console's life did we ever actually get that down, but that doesn't fix the problem. That problem is making this game nigh unplayable at times, just because the camera will get stuck on a platform that Gex missed jumping through, because sometimes the perspective's a little bit wonky because the camera will flip positions, and you just have no idea where you are spatially. And you might very well die because enemies are hitting you and you're completely lost because the camera is stuck on the environment. And your controls kind of sort of change direction depending on the relativity of the camera to you. So actually controlling Gex in this situation is absolutely abysmal just because of the god-awful camera. When you're in this big 3D environment, you are allowed to play around with Gex's abilities and really get a feel for him as a character. And this is great, creating a neutral environment where there isn't too many ways to hurt yourself, aside from burning yourself on torches or maybe falling to your death. You can just play around with your abilities, and Gex actually has an impressive array of abilities. He can run, he can jump, he has a higher jump. If you press jump, after you press jump and then hold it down, it's basically the DuckTales pogo jump. I don't particularly like this, especially because this game has a tendency to drop inputs, which I think is specifically because the frame rate tends to chug at times, but sometimes the game will just actively decide you're not doing a higher jump. But I think the alternative of just holding down jump after your initial jump, that would work substantially better than having to press jump a second time mid-air and hold it down. But that's just me. That's a very small thing that doesn't really affect all that much. Again, aside from when the frame rate decides to drop your inputs. Gex also has the ability to climb walls, which is a little bit disorienting if I'm being completely honest, but the bigger issue with this is he can't climb all the walls, only set specifically designed ones, and unfortunately because every stage has a different theme, those walls actually have different tiles, so you kind of just have to blindly figure out what exactly each wall in each world style is. And that's not fun. That's obtuse, and it might feel like you're stuck even though you're not, just because you don't know which walls you can climb to get out of a situation. He can do flying karate kicks, which gives him something of an active hitbox while using a long jump, which can be very useful for getting around the environment very quickly. He has a tail attack, which is kind of got a wonky hitbox. Like, I think it's supposed to hit 360 degrees around him, but it doesn't quite work out that way. The hitbox on the tail attack's a little bit weird for me. He can also swim in one specific level and no other level, which is why the fluids in every other level will probably do damage to him in some way, shape, or form, because there's only swimming in the N64 exclusive level, and it's not very good. His running is a little bit problematic because he handles a bit like a walrus, and not a cool party walrus, but a fat, dead, bloated walrus that's just been hit by a garbage truck. Seriously, making the tightest turns will make him do like these huge circles, and it just feels like you don't have the precision of movement that you'd like for tight turning, which can be awkward, especially when you're trying to resituate yourself with the camera going all over the place in some of the more awkward situations. Once you've got your abilities down, you have to go and run around and find little TVs. These TVs are set to specific channels, and these channels are the stages you are going to play. There is a set number of red remotes over the TV. These are the main collectibles. They're the Mario stars of the game, so to speak. And before you start a stage, you can get a little bit of a hint, although a hint is being generous. Basically, you select whichever remote you want to go after, although you could go after others, and it will show you a quick camera zoom in for like the room right before the remote, and you're just supposed to infer what you're supposed to do off that. I feel like there's not really a lot of context or understanding as to what specifically these are supposed to do, and really it just feels like time filler that doesn't really do its job of trying to inform the player of what's specifically supposed to be done in order to get this main collectible. The stage variety themselves is also a bit of an issue because there are 14 total stages, not including the bonus stages, and there are like maybe 5 different stage layouts. In fact, I can probably go over them off the top of my head. You have cartoons, horror, computer world, prehistory, sci-fi, oh, and there's also Chinese Food Network. There are 6 main environments that you're going to be going through, and they are repeated, and this really, really bugs me. Like, I know Mario 64 did this around the same time, and that felt very lazy of them as well to have multiple ice worlds and the like. But here, it gets really egregious. There are 3 different cartoon channels you need to jump into over the course of the game. And it gets kind of really bad because the game is sectioned off into various locales where you have to defeat a boss or get X number of remotes before you can progress to the next chunk of the game. The very second stage you go to is horror themed, and when you finish that, you can then go on to the first boss. You then unlock the second chunk of all the stages, of which one of them is a horror stage. So as early as the third stage in, they're already repeating. And I guess now would be a good enough time to talk about the third pillar of why I think this game isn't particularly good. If I may very loosely butcher a Roger Ebert quote here for a moment, the developers of this game understand that people make games in 3 dimensions now, but they have not learned why. The way I see Gexistence is it's not really designed as a 3-dimensional game, and they haven't really built the mentality of this. It's apples to oranges, but I think there's enough of a parallel here that it's worth mentioning. It's kind of alongside Mario 64. If we look at the original Super Mario Bros., at the end of every single stage, you see a flagpole. And that flagpole is designed to signify an ending to the stage. You know exactly where you are and where the ending is, because once you get there, you're done. If you go into Mario 64, you'll notice that there are absolutely none of those things. And that is because the stages are designed in 3 dimensions, and 3 dimensions allow for 2 very important things. First of all, it entices you based on your sense of wonder and exploration. There's a huge world out here with all sorts of nooks and crannies to explore, so go figure out where you need to go and go do some stuff. You don't immediately see where the ending is, and the other big contributing factor to why 3D worlds are so great is that there isn't a singular fixed ending point. Gex doesn't seem to get that so much. And, let me make something clear. There's nothing inherently wrong with making a 3-dimensional game with more linear, 2-dimensional sensibilities. I mean, Crash Bandicoot does it, and that's a pretty popular series. Bomberman Hero did that, and at least I liked that game. The 2 big problems with Gex in this regard are that 1, it doesn't utilize the meaningful strengths of 3-dimensional design in any way, shape, or form, but also, just in terms of a general mentality, this feels like it's a 3D game just because everyone else was moving to 3 dimensions. Gex feels like very much a Me Too mascot platformer. It's seeing trends and it's trying to follow them, but without really doing anything meaningful to add its own voice to the mix, or doing anything remotely interesting with it. It's being very safe and very much like everything else, but not actually capitalizing on anything in that regard. This game could be a 2-dimensional game, and it would probably be better because at least you wouldn't have to deal with the camera. It's especially egregious in the first stage, however, where the entire first stage is effectively one very long linear corridor, and there's one story-based remote located pretty much at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end, and you just sort of choose when you want to abandon the level as quickly as possible. It reminds me a lot of how Sonic Heroes was handled, where it had 3 different groups of characters who played all identically. It was just a matter of how quickly they left the stage. And it's very much the same with Gex. You don't really get any sort of sense of wonder or adventure here because the levels are very linear, and while the first stage is the most egregious out of the bunch, the best they can do is multiple linear paths without any real sense of exploration. Take a look at the second horror-themed area. In the second room, the path just splits 3 ways, and each one of those paths is basically a linear route to one remote. Unless, of course, you get to the remote and you just jump around to get the other remotes, because you can do that. And this is something that really bugs me, because 3-dimensional games are wondrous for how intricate you can make their stage design, You can hide stuff in all sorts of nooks and crannies and really invoke the desire to explore and expand and see what this world is and all the little hidden mysteries of it. Gex has none of that. The most it has is if it hides something that's mission critical behind an awkward camera angle. Like in the second stage where you have to destroy coolers of blood and eyeballs, one is just behind a door that's behind a camera angle that you'll never see unless you backtrack the entire stage. And that's what frustrates me about the way this world is designed. You have very linear worlds that don't really capitalize on what makes 3-dimensional space so amazing. And then you have a character that is as flat as cardboard and doesn't have a personality, and at best he'll just be quipping at you over and over again, and he won't shut up unless you turn it off in the menu. Which is a small mercy to be sure, but it just makes the character unlikable in a world that's not fun to explore, and is at best frustrating because you'll be battling the camera every single step of the way. The only other real Gexploration that this game provides is collecting a bunch of collectibles that will eventually lead you to one bonus remote, and one remote that's actually hidden in the environment, and usually an out-of-the-way, kind of hidden behind the camera place. I actually like these. I don't think they're handled very well, because again, they're usually in places that just are missed by the camera more than anything, but at least they require you to keep an eye out and interact with the environment in a more meaningful way and actually try to explore. These hidden remotes are like the one shining bright light in the sort of murky averageness of all the other collectibles in the game. They're not done terribly well, but at the very least they make you explore and take an interest in the world. It's just a shame that the rest of the game doesn't bother with it. And not bothering feels like Gex's entire MO, both as a character and as a series. This game can also be really badly programmed and buggy. I'm gonna apologize for this bit straight on. OBS completely reset all my settings and I didn't realize it, so I kinda had to throw pretty much all my footage out and had to restart. But I kept this clip because I couldn't replicate it. In the N64 exclusive Titanic level, I actually soft-locked myself. This was the third soft lock I actually managed to get myself into while playing this game. I can't remember what the other level was, but once it also happened on the overworld. We'll talk about that in a sec. But in the Titanic level, you have to, for some reason, hit a button right behind where you start spawn, which is a baffling choice, and then you have to hit some switches to open and close doors. Well, somehow I managed to close the door behind me, which is what you have to do, but the switch to open the next door failed to work. And the switch to open the door behind me, that locked up. I was just stuck permanently in this room because I couldn't open any doors. And I had to exit the stage. Now, fortunately, this was on a fresh level refresh, so it's not that big a deal, but say I was going for the collectibles remotes as well. You know, you need 120 collectibles. I could have been very well along the way to doing that and would have lost all my progress just to this soft lock. And then at one point, I actually managed to break some progression lock-offs in the main hub world, where you're supposed to take like this platform that says you need 26 remotes. I only had 22 at the time, but it still took me where I needed to go, to some lion head statue. And while its mouth was closed, I could actually jump through that and get to the final stage. And I was just stuck there because the platform was gone and I didn't have enough remotes to even unlock the final stage. I think what you're supposed to do is have X number of remotes and then the lion's head statue opens its mouth, and then you go and check to see if you can go do that stage, assume you can't, and head back. Unfortunately, that was impossible, so I was actually soft-locked in the hub world too. Awesome! Most enemies take way too many hits to kill, if you can kill them at all, and it feels really underwhelming when you actually do manage to defeat them. Like, there's no cool Gexplosions or anything. They just sort of dissolve into little tiny triangular polygons, and it just feels kind of underwhelming. There are also bonus stages that I think show up if you collect all the special controllers. I don't know, I was 100%ing levels, so I'm not sure what specifically triggered them, but I think it was the bonus controllers. And these are bad. Basically, you're just dropped into a very small, very simple 3D environment, and you have to collect all the things under a time limit. But, and here's the critical thing, even though your mission is to, again, collect all the things, the level does not end when you do that, nor does the timer stop. Because once you collect all the things, you have to then go find the remote, which is somewhere in the level, and you have to get it before the timer actually ticks down. I had problems with one specific level for this because it was designed in a way that's basically mirrored. You're like in a city street and there's like trains on both sides, and if you collect all of the police badges, because it's a cop-themed show for some reason, one of the trains will show up with the remote in it. Now the thing is, it's always fixed, it's not random or anything, but there's a train on both sides and they look basically identical. How are you gonna figure out which one that is? And you have a timer ticking down and awkward platforms that you have to kind of jump through because the collision is very, very wonky in this game. And hopefully you can get where you need to go before the timer runs out. I lost that bonus game like 3 times just trying to orient myself at the end after I collected everything. They are not the best. There's one that's set in a James Bond themed world, which conveniently uses the same theme song as the main overworld, so they didn't have to put in any extra effort for that. And even though I had completed the objective, I was stuck in a final room I can't show you because I'm genuinely worried about seizures, because for some reason they made very fast flashing lights for this, and the camera was so wonky, like I'd keep flinging myself off into space because I just had to make a blind jump. And this game is just filled with blind jumps everywhere. It is very player hostile with its jumps, especially in regards to consistency and relativity to the camera, because you are fighting that camera every step of the way, and maybe you'll make the jump, but it's really hard to judge distance sometimes as well. And the bosses in this game are nothing to write home about. Utilize the environment to hit your opponent 3 times with a slight variation on the final hit, and that's sort of your lot. In the first fight, the enemies move slightly, so it's harder to line up your shots, and the second boss has like extra pits in the stage. Actually, there's a place in the second boss arena where you can just stand still and be completely unharmed by the enemy. And if you stand there, they're programmed to just keep doing the same attack over and over that can't possibly hit you. Now granted, you can't hit them from here either, but it's kind of weird that there's just this empty space where you can just stand and be totally fine and unthreatened. And the boss fight itself will be basically in a perfect stalemate for all eternity. And the final boss isn't really any different. Again, it's just hit him a few times and it's sort of over. There's not really any build up to it. There's not really any sense of growing as a player and as a character, mastering your tools to utilize your environments to go after one final challenge. But, you know, of course, Mario did that too. And to be fair, there wasn't any N64 game where the final boss was a large gauntlet that utilized every single mechanic you experienced in the game to create one final super hard, super challenging final boss gauntlet that really put its players to the test, all while having a great narrative impact when you finally defeat the final boss. Oh wait. Well, you know, we can't all be a good game. Some of us have to be Gex. Basically, Gex is an aggressively average game in terms of content, but it's not fun to really experience that content. You're not really given any sense of purpose to it. It's just, you're in these stages, do these general missions around these areas to ultimately get the remotes, move on with your life, eventually defeat the boss. But why? Who is this boss? Why are we doing this? Why are we collecting remotes? What is anything in this game? This feels like the most Me Too mascot platformer of all time. There's not a lot in terms of gameplay to Gexistence that I think is all that good. And well, I'll definitely give them credit. They probably used this as a learning tool to make the next game better. You know, Gex 3 wasn't that much better from what I remember, although I might have to go back and check at some point. Either way, Gexistence is a game that is subpar at the best of times in terms of gameplay, and it's just frustrating to deal with every single step of the way, so I can't really say it's an enjoyable experience. The overall presentation to Gex isn't really much better. Visually, it's probably the high point of the game. The environments do fit their themes pretty well, but again, the repetition will hurt this pretty badly. Although I will give credit where credit's due, Gex actually does get some bespoke animations and costumes depending on where you are in the world. I remember specifically standing around the horror area, and he'd actually like turn his head 360. That's kind of cool actually. But a lot of the textures and stuff are very, very muddy. At one point in that same level, you have like a forced moment where the game zooms in first-person mode on a sign, but the programming is not lined up properly, so you don't even get to see the whole sign, and it's so blurry, even if you couldn't make out the words. The enemies themselves are largely nondescript, general-themed, amorphous blobs that fit each area. You've got like a bouncing pumpkin in the horror area, and in the tech area, it's basically the same enemy, but now it's like a resistor. Hooray. Honestly, there's not really much to say about the enemies themselves. Gex is probably the most personality-filled character in the game, and that's a concerning statement to say the least. Audio-wise, Gex never shuts up in these games. The PlayStation version, he has even more stuff to say, so there's a lot less repetition to what he says, but it's annoying all the same. In terms of music, it's okay, I guess. Most of it's pretty unremarkable, although there are a few interesting audio bugs with this game, with some of the collectibles just completely killing the audio sometimes for some reason. The collectible silver remote, for whatever reason, just completely acts as the background music, and I don't know why. And the sound effects in general are completely stock. It seems like they went out of their way to pick like the most cartoony and obnoxious sound effects they could, and that camera sound will be burned into my mind forever, and I don't want it there. Overall, the presentation of Gexistence it's passable. That's what it's got going for it, but most of the game is about that quality too. Now, if you want a copy of Gexistence on the N64, cheapest copy I see on eBay right now is about $30. And that is not a price point I would be comfortable paying for this. Like, if this game was a $5, maybe, but unless you're a die-hard Gex fan, there's one of you in this world, maybe that's worth it to you. But honestly, this game is kind of just aggressively average, if not boring and outright frustrating. The main character is kind of nothing of an actual character by design, which I still do not really understand the point of, nor do I understand how they expect you to connect with it. And the gameplay this character's dropped in is frustrating at the best of times just because of this having one of the worst cameras on the Nintendo 64. Gexistence is far from the worst game on the system, mind you. It's not even the worst 3D platformer on the system. I can name several that would top this, but it's not a high-ranking game on the system. And I would struggle to think there's any demand at all for another one. I think the people making the Gex collection want people to get all Gex-cited about it, but for me, I'm just left with nothing but Gexistential dread. Remembering how bad it was fighting the camera every step of the way, the repetitive nature of all the levels, the bafflingly annoying main character, the non-existent plot. There's nothing here that makes this game really all that interesting. But regardless of whether or not you agree with me in regards to this being a game that's remotely good or not, I think we can all agree that re-releasing stuff like this just smacks of corporate Gexploitation of its fans. Because I don't see something like this trying to build a new fan base, because it's not creating anything new, nor would it create anything that would appeal to modern audiences. It's here exclusively just for the people who would be nostalgic for that time, and honestly, is this game all that nostalgic? Like I said at the start, this was one of those games. You only rented it because nothing else was there, and even in my case, you ended up with this because you tried to get the sequel, which was marginally better, and the people behind the counter couldn't tell the difference between the two or didn't have the sequel, but still had it on the shelf for some reason. This was a game you kind of had to force yourself to play, and it's not a game I would consider enjoyable, and it's not one I would openly recommend to anyone. But you know what? Let's be fair. I showed a quick list of N64 games that I think are objectively worse than Gexistence. So let's take a moment and give a quick list of games I think are substantially better and more worth your time on the system so that you can point that energy in that direction instead and have a good time. Yeah, that's about right. Good night, everyone.